Well, the day after Rudy Giuliani popped his eyes on TV and said that maybe there was a little collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, but Donald Trump knew nothing about it. And with the New York Times reporting that their inside the White House sources tell them that President Trump believes he is getting crushed in the coverage of the government shutdown that he caused, the president came up with a way that he believed he could win the shutdown coverage today. Take away the Air Force plane that is used for flying the Speaker of the House. And the president did that on the very same day that he authorized an Air Force plane, same kind of plane, to fly Melania Trump to their home in Florida for no government purpose whatsoever. A story confirmed tonight by NBC News, that Melania Trump flight. That is not going to change the 57% of voters who say in a Marist poll they will definitely vote against Donald Trump in the 2020 election. The Speaker of the House is the second in line of succession for the presidency, frequently referred to mistakenly as the third in line, but that counts the president. Second is what she actually is. If the president has to leave office and the vice president succeeds him, and then if the vice president has to leave office, then the Speaker of the House becomes president. There is no public evidence that Donald Trump knows this, and it is very unlikely that Donald Trump knows why the Speaker of the House is flown on government planes, just like the president and the vice president. It's because of 9/11. 9/11 was the first time in American history where for a couple of hours the national security apparatus of the United States and the full Congress and everyone in America had a right to worry about the line of succession of the presidency and exactly where everyone in that line was on that day. There were two hijacked commercial airliners headed to Washington, D.C., believed to be targeting either the White House or the Capitol. At the Capitol, the Speaker of the House could have been killed, along with hundreds of members of Congress. And in the White House that day, the vice president could have been killed. And the president's national security team and Secret Service were so worried that President Bush could be killed that day that they kept Air Force One flying zigzag patterns in the sky on its way to an undisclosed location in Nebraska. It was the first time in history that the Speaker of the House, the president, and the vice president of the United States were all hiding out from an enemy attack that could kill them all. The president's wife was hiding out in the basement of the Capitol, where Laura Bush had gone that day to lobby Congress on an issue that concerned her. And while all of that was happening, Donald Trump was on local television in New York City after the Twin Towers fell, proudly proclaiming that he now had the tallest building in the area where the World Trade Center once stood. So Donald Trump doesn't know that it is only since that day, that nightmare come true, that the Speaker of the House no longer flies commercial. Not since the day that national security experts and the White House and the Congress finally realized that it really is possible to lose the president and the vice president at the same time. Because Donald Trump knows none of that, he sent Nancy Pelosi a letter today suggesting that she fly commercial. After ordering the grounding of the government plane that was going to take the Speaker of the House to Brussels to meet with NATO commanders and then Afghanistan to meet with American military commanders and American troops, the president told the Speaker in a letter, obviously, if you would like to make your journey by flying commercial, that would certainly be your prerogative. There is clearly no one working in the Trump White House who knows why the Speaker does not fly commercial anymore. Or perhaps this letter was actually written by one of those people in the Trump administration who was described in an anonymous New York Times op-ed piece last year as secretly working against Donald Trump's interests within his own administration. If that's the case, the Trump opponent within the Trump administration, who might have had a hand in this letter, would want the letter to be as ridiculous as it could possibly be. Mission accomplished. It's certainly unusual for the Speaker to leave the country during a government shutdown, but Nancy Pelosi has done everything she can to reopen the government. She has passed funding bills through the House of Representatives that all of the Republicans in the Senate voted for before Christmas, before Donald Trump changed his mind about those bills and refused to sign them, and with that, deliberately, personally shut down the government. You don't need Nancy Pelosi or any member of the House of Representatives to reopen the government now. You simply need a vote by the United States Senate to pass the bills that Nancy Pelosi has already passed through the House of Representatives. And today, a quiet version of chaos broke out in the United States Senate because of Mitch McConnell's refusal to move those bills. But it was chaos only in the eyes of Senate parliamentarians and went virtually unnoticed by the news media. So here's your Senate procedure lesson for the night. It is up to the Senate Majority Leader to bring bills to a vote in the Senate, right? Well, as with everything in the Senate, the answer is yes, but. The answer is yes, but that is not a Senate rule. It's just a Senate tradition. The truth is anyone, any member of the Senate, can ask to bring a bill up for debate and a vote, and they can do it saying exactly the same thing that the Majority Leader says when he does it. The tradition of reserving that privilege to the Majority Leader is just to prevent an endless traffic jam of legislation on the Senate floor. But every once in a while, and this is very, very rare, frustration boils over with the Majority Leader, and some other senator just decides to grab the microphone and stand up and ask to take up a bill for debate and a vote. I saw that happen exactly once in all of my years working on the Senate and on the Senate floor. And it was the senator I was working for who did it, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And the Majority Leader had to literally come running onto the Senate floor to object and stop it. And for Senate geeks, it was a wild, out of control moment. For most people watching C-SPAN, it was as if nothing happened. And today, it was Virginia's junior Senator Tim Kaine who got mad as hell and just couldn't take it anymore. And he seized that tradition away from the Majority Leader. And here is what that stunning rebellion looked like on the Senate floor today. Here is Democratic Senator Tim Kaine's own personal Kaine mutiny on the floor of the United States Senate.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 5 H.R. 21, making appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019. I further ask that the bill be considered, read a third time, and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection?
Objection.
Objection is heard.
That objection was from Mitch McConnell. Huh? Pretty exciting stuff. I mean, could you just feel the tension in the room? Could you feel everybody's anxiety? What's going to happen? I'm telling you, every retired Senate parliamentarian sitting at home watching that on C-SPAN today was on the edge of his seat. The Republican Minority Leader of the House, Kevin McCarthy, who was hoping to be riding in the Speaker of the House's plane this year, today said he was shocked, just shocked, that the Speaker would even consider leaving the country during a government shutdown, but he apparently forgot to be shocked when the President of the United States left the country after he started the shutdown.
I'm just shocked she'd even think that she would leave the country. Why would you leave the country with government shut down and you're Speaker of the House? Why would you even thank the department?
Iraq while the government was shut down.
Because Nancy Pelosi was where at the time when he went to Iraq to visit the troops? I think she was in Hawaii. But so I don't quite know. No, you're missing the whole point, I guess.
Why are those two things equal? I don't know. The president traveled.
What part?
He wanted to travel.
Being Speaker of the House and leaving the country when it's shut down, I don't think that's appropriate. Especially the Speaker thinks we shouldn't even have the State of the Union.
And here's the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, Steny Hoyer.
I think the actions of the president were petty, mean-spirited, and beneath any president of the United States to take. After all, Nancy Pelosi is the third in line to be president of the United States. Doing this small, petty act is unfortunately all too regular for this president.
Leading off our discussion now, John Heilemann, national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's also the co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. And Sam Stein is the politics editor of The Daily Beast and an MSNBC political analyst. And John Heilemann, NBC News reporting tonight that the plane that the First Lady used to fly alone to Florida is a version of 757, exactly the same plane that Nancy Pelosi was scheduled to use on her trip.
I want to note first, before we delve into this matter, that seeing you letting your full Senate dork flag fly is a glorious thing.
It's hard to contain myself.
It's been a long. Back in the day, Lawrence. Back in the day, you used to let that thing fly on a daily basis. It's rare. It's a rare sight today, almost as rare as what Tim Kaine did. So viewers should be feel satisfied and happy to have seen it. I was on television with Sam earlier today, and we were talking about the Trump gambit. And at the time, we did not know that Melania Trump had taken a government plane to go to Florida. And at that time, I thought that the maneuver by the president qualified as tactically inept and strategically dim-witted. I now would like to revise and extend my remarks in the tradition of Congress and say that, tactically speaking, it is now doubly inept, beyond inept, glaringly, obviously, just such a blunder at a tactical level, the optical level. All the arguments that Nancy Pelosi would have made about being denied her chance to go on this important trip, on seeing the troops, on learning things, on doing all that stuff that Trump was keeping him from doing that was important to the United States' interests around the world, are now compounded, those arguments, by the juxtaposition with what they've done with the First Lady. And then, of course, there's strategic fallacy here, which is that there is literally nothing that what Donald Trump did today, other than make himself feel good. They did nothing to actually advance his cause. It has changed nothing about the politics of the shutdown. It has got him not an inch closer to getting the government back open or to getting his wall built. And so he's managed to make a fool of himself tactically while accomplishing absolutely nothing strategically. Good day, Mr. President.
Sam.
I mean, there's not much to add to that. Trump operates off this idea that if he just, what they say, own the libs, if he shoves it in their face, that it'll be beneficial to him in the long run. And clearly, there's no strategic imperative here that is advanced, which I note. We were talking about this earlier. Something he could have done was take a second trip himself abroad to say, thank you for your service. I'm so sorry the government shut down, but you keep doing what you got to do. He didn't do that. He stayed at home. One thing he could be doing is talking to red state Democratic senators or members of Congress who hail from districts he won in 2016. We talked to every single Democratic office from a state or a district he won in 2016. Only 2 have heard from him. So he's not doing the sort of practical things that one would do to try to break this impasse. What he's doing is sort of stagecraft, and he's not doing it particularly well, as the polls show.
But as the top government worker on the organizational chart, he does feel free to speak for all government workers. We're going to have a furloughed federal worker on later in the hour, because I don't really know how they're feeling. I'm going to ask them. Right. Donald Trump never has, but he's telling us that all these 800,000, they're fine with the shutdown, according to Donald Trump.
Well, I think obviously Donald Trump doesn't know anything about most working people, and certainly most government workers. And there's been some reporting which strikes me as wholly credible, the notion that what Trump thought at the outset was he liked this notion of shutdown because he thinks that all the government workers, and many of them he encounters in Washington, D.C., are in fact Democrats. What, of course, he forgets is that there are tens of thousands of federal employees spread out across the country doing vital things. Those people are, many of them, Trump voters. And in certain places where I think where some of the political pressure that might bring this shutdown to an end because of the political pressure on Republicans and on Mitch McConnell, when the transportation issues start to really bite, when the storm hits, when it turns out that one of the major hub airports gets locked up because there's an issue with the air traffic controllers or with TSA, Donald Trump is going to realize something that he doesn't even know now, which is, I'm sure, I bet every dollar in my pocket that Donald Trump has no idea that the air traffic controllers are federal employees. Like, he doesn't know anything about that. So not only cannot speak for them, he doesn't really even know who they are.
Sam, the reason I ran the Tim Kaine video was not just my geekery. That for me is the pebble running down the mountain that could be the avalanche. It means that procedurally there can come a day when a Democrat stands up and does that, right, and Mitch McConnell isn't even physically there on the floor, right, deliberately, to run out there and object. And the word goes out to the Republicans, don't object. Let it come to a vote, or even if there's an objection, let it move over into the space where we have the 60-vote threshold vote to overrule the objection. In other words, let this thing procedurally happen the way Tim Kaine tried to do today. We could be 2 weeks away from that happening or 3 weeks away from that happening, but that is the way that it could unfold in the end, that Nancy Pelosi's bills are taken from the House of Representatives and passed with 60 votes or more in the United States Senate, and Mitch McConnell doesn't touch it.
Well, and you would know more about the procedural stuff than I do here, but at that juncture, Trump will be faced with a choice, right? I can veto this and send it back, or I can just swallow my pride and sign the thing. My suspicion is he'll probably end up vetoing the measure and putting Mitch McConnell back on the stand basically again to say, well, will I allow the veto override to go through? But in the end, I think we both all agree, which is that this gets done from a parliamentary standpoint if you chip away at the Republican opposition. And so far you've seen a handful of Senate Republicans say, let's open the government, let's debate border wall funding while the government's open. But Mitch McConnell remains firm in saying, no, we're not going to have a vote yet.
And, John, in Georgia, we have Republican Senator Johnny Isakson, who is, among other things, the senator representing Delta Airlines. Since their headquarters is down there, they've got your giant Hartsfield Airport there. Here's his advice, his public advice for ending the shutdown. He has advised the TSA agents to all go on strike, which is illegal for federal government workers. In other words, the Republican senator from Georgia is advocating the end to the shutdown is you government workers commit a crime, and then we in Washington will be then forced into some kind of solution here in the Senate, and Donald Trump will be forced into a solution. But unless the government workers commit a crime, Johnny Isakson is not going to do anything legal in his job in the United States Senate to solve this problem.
Right. I mean, it's doubly crazy, right? Because he's not only advocating that they commit a crime, he's a Republican in 2018 urging government employees to go on strike. When's the last time you've heard an elected Republican advocating organized labor action, collective action on the part of a union? Unionized employees. Look, it's obviously nuts. And again, I think your point is really well taken, because one guesses, like, Tim Kaine is not quite the Senate dork that you are, but he's a Senate dork. And my guess is that part of what he's doing he did not expect, he knew that objection was going to come from Mitch McConnell or one of the other Republicans, but he's putting, it's not just a pebble in the pond, he's putting his toe in the water to kind of say, it's like the first, and this is possible. This is how you do it. He's suggesting the possibility. He's getting the scent in the air of the kind of rebellion, of what passes for rebellion in the United States.
But to your point, I mean, what's remarkable about the Isakson solution is just the pure abdication of responsibility and power. I mean, these people have agency. They have votes. They can pass legislation. They can actually buck the president. But his solution is not.
Or at least go talk to Mitch McConnell.
His solution is not to even cast a vote. It's to pass it on to the poor government workers who are working without salary to have a collective action moment, and therefore force the president to buckle. It's remarkable. It's sad.
I promise you, if there's anything left of the reasonable Republican Mitch McConnell who I knew when I was working in the Senate, when Tim Kaine was up there saying that, there was a part of Mitch McConnell's brain saying, why don't I just stay sitting down? Why don't I just not say a word? Let this thing go.
Part of him quietly saying, they're going, you go. You go, Tim.
Exactly. Sam Stein, John Howman, thank you both for starting us off tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.